Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. We're moving towards the season of Lent, as you well know. This Sunday will be Quinquagesima Sunday, one of my favourite words of the year. I just love getting my lips around that. Quinquagesima Sunday, which means that there are 50 days until Easter. And as Lent looms, and as war breaks out in Europe, the lectionary leads us into some pretty tough scriptures. The Bible is full of comfort and of promise, but it has a hard edge to it as well. It expects great things from us people of faith. Let no one tell you that the life of faith is an easy option. It demands things from us that are rarely asked of human beings today. It demands selflessness, charity, discipline, sacrifice, and focus. And at the same time, the world around us offers pleasure, riches, rewards, personal satisfaction. So frankly, faith is sometimes a tough sell. Sometimes people warn me not to bang on too much about sacrifice, selflessness, and discipline for fear of spooking the horses, or rather specifically, for fear of being a stumbling block to new believers. Today's readings definitely come in that category of hard teachings. There's not much to comfort us here, is there? James seems to be foaming at the mouth over the iniquity of the rich. In fact, we should have dressed Sandra in prophetic sackcloth and had her stand upon a podium to rail James's words at the crowd. The wages of the labourers which you kept back by fraud cry out, says James to the rich. Come now, you rich people, weep and wail for the miseries that are coming to you, he warns. James has really got it in for the wealthy of his time, hasn't he? He knows that wealthy people bear a huge responsibility for the way that they, or should I say we, use our wealth. Today, for example, in the fields of the Ukraine, we see that it is not the poor Slavic peasants who have enabled the war that has broken out. War takes wealth to buy weapons and equip troops. War requires wealth in vast quantities. And those who have appropriated the wealth of the Russian economy to themselves in recent decades bear the greatest responsibility for the war now taking place. So there's a warning to the wealthy. And then Jesus comes to us through Mark's gospel with dire warnings of the cost of putting a stumbling block in anyone's way. What's a stumbling block, you may ask? Well, essentially, it's anything that we might do that has the effect of turning another person away from God. It's perhaps the more ugly things that we do, which people of faith should know how to avoid. At the extreme ends, a good example might be the awful crimes of abuse, which sometimes raise their disgusting and ugly heads in and around churches, as well as other social institutions. The consequences for the victims of abuse are bad enough, but other people instinctively find themselves put off from joining or even remaining in churches when it happens. It's a stumbling block. It's a behavior by us that puts people off God. Now, that's at the extreme end, but at the gentler end of human behavior, I suggest we are all capable of erecting stumbling blocks. I've known people who've left churches because they don't like the gossip that goes on between members sometimes. I know others who've left because of angry words that have been exchanged between church members who are supposed to be living in a covenant of love and forgiveness with each other. People who are thinking about whether to belong tend to say to themselves when they see that kind of behavior, well, if that's how Christians behave, what evidence is there that their faith has changed anything at all? Why should I bother becoming one of them? A stumbling block then is anything which causes another person to turn aside from the path of faith. Which is why I think Jesus speaks in such firm metaphors. He's saying jumping into a lake with a millstone round your neck would be better than causing any of these little ones, he calls them, to stumble. What does he mean by a little one? Well, perhaps he meant children. There would certainly have been children in the crowd that day. But perhaps he also meant those whose faith is little, still growing, vulnerable, fragile. And then Jesus turns his face towards the things that we all do to undermine our own faith. Cut out your eye or cut off your arm if they are causing you to stumble in your own faith, he says. In other words, he says, you need to deal with the sins of the body which pull you away from the life of faith. An overemphasis on satisfying bodily impulses, perhaps. I recognize that one. Yeah. A tendency to violence or laziness or sloth. Whatever the behavior, Jesus is saying, if it gets in the way of your progress along the narrow road of faith, cut it out. At the end of these stern warnings, though, comes a word of hope from Jesus. He reminds us of the value of salt, a tiny thing, and yet something which flavors and preserves whole meals. Have salt in yourselves, he says, and be at peace with one another. Being at peace is a tough thing to ask of human beings, as we're seeing writ large in the Ukraine today. Being at peace with each other means forgiving one another when we stumble. It means being prepared to let insults go unanswered and carelessness forgiven. It surely means recognizing that we are all works in progress and that none of us is divine and none of us gets it right all the time. We're all going to fail, to stumble at some point, and we need others and God to lift us up when we do. One of the ways that we lift each other up is by being salt to one another, by adding the flavor of love, forgiveness, charity, and care for one another. We add flavor to the life of faith. By lifting each other up when we stumble, we mirror the action of God himself, who always longs to lift us up and to help us walk along the narrow way. Ultimately, salt is the love of God, shared between the people of God. Love is what binds us. Love is what carries us forward. Love is what adds flavor and depth to our relationships. Love will ultimately save us, whether in our personal lives and interactions or on the battlefields of the Ukraine. So as Lent approaches, I invite you to let God add salt to your life as a Christian. Make a commitment, perhaps, to engage with the Lent program, printed again in this week's Chronicle for you. Use the opportunity of Lent to rekindle your own saltiness, your own love for God and for each other, by taking the time to ponder and to pray, to be challenged and strengthened by all that God, through Lent, has to offer you. I promise you, you'll be glad if you do. Amen.